So, we're very happy to take questions. Yes.
First question is a straightforward one. This is obviously Stafford Hospital, so we're going to focus, and because of where we are in terms of it being a foundation trust, you've had to go through a process to get there. But is there any difference in what you're doing here, effectively, from any other DGH of a similar size in the country? Because we've been told privately that DGH is serving populations of 200,000 or less with an income of less than 250 million a year, are being broken up in this way. And what you're arguing here is exactly the same things: maternity, paediatrics and accident emergency services. So can you come clean to us? Is this a national process that's going on and you just happen to be doing this because it's a foundation trust?
Well, I'll make a comment and then hand over to Hugo. There's certainly no national process, but I think it's fair enough to say there are other trusts with somewhat similar challenges. Now, because Mid Stafford is a particularly small trust, and because of some of its history, it faces the challenges in particular. But there are similar issues elsewhere, but this is not a national process. We are only focused on this one particular trust. But Hugo, do you want to say anything about this?
Well, like I answered very briefly, I know of no national process that's driving this.
Well, we've been to Herefordshire, they're talking about the same thing. The same thing's going on in Redditch. I'm just talking in this region already. I'm wondering, we're talking about this trust being 116 out of 165 for paediatrics. Sure. That means 50 trusts are below it in terms of its paediatric processes. So will all those have to change in the same way?
Well, I don't think I can answer that question as clearly as you might like me to. But it does seem to me, in fairness to your question, that the sort of drivers that you've seen in Stafford may well be occurring elsewhere. And it does seem to me that over time change will have to occur across the health service, not just in Stafford. So it would be naive and disingenuous to pretend that some of the factors that have occurred and driven difficulties in Stafford can't be identified elsewhere. So in my personal view, and I stress it's in my personal view, will change have to occur across the health service, recognising the changes that have occurred in healthcare? Yes, I think it probably will. But is that part of some organised national process? Not to my knowledge. Have I addressed your question there?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. The drivers are the same. They will occur in other places. Similar changes may or may not have to occur. But as far as I know, to the best of my knowledge, there's no national process that's organising it. And certainly from the contingency planning team's standpoint, this has been very specifically addressing the problems of mid-staffs.
A corollary question in terms of the finances and whatever, just obviously before we move on to the future, but if Stafford had taken the decision to close Cannock, which was underperforming, and if the government wasn't reducing the financing that it's doing in terms of its tariff, would Stafford be viable as an ongoing trust?
Our work showed that would not be the case.
Even if it took those 2 years?
Yeah. So we did part of the work that we undertook was to look at the potential closure of the Cannock, because it was very clear in the early weeks of the work that we did that it was, to all intents and purposes, the elephant in the room. But what that showed was that was not going to get the overall delivery of services to a break-even position. Added to that is the really important point that the clinical commissioning groups want to have services delivered in both Stafford and Cannock. They recognise the requirements of the local population, and they have a specific requirement for local services in both towns, not just in Stafford. So yes, we excluded it from a financial perspective, but we also excluded it because it was a requirement for the local population.
And just to add to that, it wouldn't address some of the clinical safety issues that I've been talking about. So it may improve, but not solve the financial problems. It would clearly detract from the service which is offered in Cannock. It wouldn't be what commissioners want provided, and it wouldn't solve the clinical safety issues.
But the other issue, which is about finances, if the words you used yourselves was a smaller hospital in Stafford and a smaller hospital in Cannock, how can that be financially viable if one of the issues is about underutilisation of the buildings?
So one of the big issues there, it's around what are the delivery of services within the small hospital. So there are a number of high-cost services that you would have in a standard BGH that you would not have within a smaller local hospital. Hugo touched on intensive care earlier. Intensive care is a very high cost in a local hospital and in a DGH. If you take that out, it then starts to make the other services more financially viable. So the key focus for us was to get the right spread of clinical services that produced that financially viable local model. The minute you start to tip into more specialist care, you then are paying a premium to deliver that service for a smaller population, if that makes sense.
I think it's important to emphasise, though, isn't it, that your approach was to say what sort of configuration services will provide high-quality services,
Absolutely.
and then are those financially sustainable?
Yeah.
And just to be completely clear with you, commissioners have said they wanted a hospital in both towns. They didn't say necessarily on the current site, and undoubtedly if you did change the service configuration, then you would want to look at the most effective use of estate.
Other questions?
Yeah, what services are going to be swallowed up by a University Hospital of North Staffordshire, and could a merger with UHNS actually be one of the options for the future of the...
Well, Hugo can probably talk more specifically about where services might go, where patients might go who might currently be going to Stafford in particular, but for certain UHNS will be the obvious place, and indeed, as Hugo was saying, of course, we've already got some of the emergency services now being directed directly to Stoke. Precisely what is possible, though, is something that TSA has got to work on. So it's one thing to say, in principle, and you'll see from the report, the team has looked at the capacity of neighbouring trusts and the extent to which they could absorb some extra activity. But you also have to look at all the organisational implications of doing that, and we know that some of the neighbouring trusts are struggling themselves. So that's one of the most important things that the TSA is going to have to work through. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I don't think it's possible to, at this point, identify service by service. But in principle, it would probably be the more technologically challenging services. And good examples would be the current changes which have occurred in major trauma, cardiac services and in stroke, where for good reason and with good results those services have been moved to Stoke, to North Staffs. In terms of the merger question, I do think that the key question is producing clinically sustainable and financially sustainable services. You may need to change the organisational form in order to allow that, for all sorts of reasons: data protection issues, clinical governance issues, staff moving freely between sites. But that should be driven by the conclusion you've reached about sustainability, and not simply on some assumption that simply by merging that will solve the problems, because the evidence is, there's quite good evidence in health service, that mergers in themselves don't solve the problems. They may facilitate finding solutions, but they won't just solve it.
Any more questions? No?
The other side of that, because we know that Stoke-on-Trent is suffering with capacity problems.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
One of the ideas that has been mooted is the idea of turning Cannock into an elective factory and then moving more work into Wolverhampton. Is that something that
It's on the list of possibilities. If we recognise, as the CPT I think have recognised, as I think the TSA will probably have to recognise, that the solution to Stafford's problems are not just within Stafford, they're across the health economy, then clearly what we can't do is to solve Stafford's problems whilst creating problems elsewhere around the health economy. No one would thank the TSA for that. So that's quite a major challenge. I wouldn't underestimate the difficulty of that. But at the end of that process, hopefully, what you'll see is something which improves not only the situation in Stafford, but potentially the situation outside Stafford. So that across the economy, there are clinically and financially sustainable services. That must be the objective. How achievable it will be, I don't think we yet know.
You'll see from the report that it does look at this issue of where elective care might be, and just says there are some options here, and precisely which option is right depends back to this question of which bits of which organisations are working together in the future. It also raises the idea that Stafford could also relieve some of the pressure on Stoke, perhaps by providing some sort of step-down facility. So, as Hugo says, we very much looked at the impact on neighbouring trust, but that is probably the key thing the TSA needs to finalise in the next step. Any other questions for us?
I want to ask just a little bit further on that.
Yeah.
So, have we absolutely discounted the idea, because obviously we haven't seen the report yet, but that another foundation trust could take over Stafford as such, and we're looking at potentially decanting services in the most convenient way to other providers?
Well, I think there's two steps to this. One is what's the configuration of services that is sustainable. We've said the current configuration isn't. You could possibly have a more limited configuration that would be sustainable as a standalone entity. You might say that would be better if it was part of, say, a larger, or had a relationship with another foundation trust, although they're not going to be a near neighbour, are they? Because at the moment, there aren't any foundation trusts as near neighbours. But that is a possibility. An alternative is to say that they should have a relationship with someone who is near, where obviously, as Hugo's been describing, there are practical things that you can do that you couldn't do at a distance. And so that's got to be looked at as well. But in that case, obviously, it wouldn't be with the foundation trust.
But my understanding is that there's an obligation to look at least the possibility of anyone who shows an interest in providing services.
Well, we certainly, as part of producing a final recommendation, the TSA certainly needs to look at whether other providers are interested in participating in some way. So if an FT somewhere else in the country said, we'd like to put our arms around Mid-Stafford and help it sustain itself, albeit with a somewhat different configuration of services, absolutely, we'd look very seriously at that. Any other questions? No? Okay, well, thank you all very much.